Welcome to my lecture on mergers and acquisitions. A merger occurs when two firms merge to become one. A good example would be when AOL and Time Warner merge to become AOL Time Warner. When a company instead acquires another company, the acquirer buys the other company, which is called the target. We will refer to the terms acquirer and target throughout today's lecture. In some ways, you're not unfamiliar with mergers and acquisitions. Essentially, mergers and acquisitions are capital budgeting on a grand scale. All the ideas that we learned for capital budgeting apply equally well to mergers and acquisitions. So, in other words, for two firms to merge, the NPV of the merger should be positive for both companies. Only thing over here, it's occurring on a really grand scale. With mergers and acquisitions, there are actually three different kinds of transactions that are all under the same umbrella of mergers and acquisitions. On this slide, I will differentiate between these three different types of transactions. But as soon as we are done with this slide, this distinction will go away. Everything else that I cover applies equally well to all three different types of transactions. The first type of transaction is the traditional merger. Under the traditional merger, two companies merge and become one. After the merger is completed, only one entity continues to exist. With a merger, the shareholders of both companies must vote to approve of the merger. The second type of transaction is acquisition of stock. When the acquirer buys sufficient shares in the target to control it, then that's an acquisition of stock. The target shareholders don't necessarily vote to approve. They approve merely by tendering or choosing not to tender their shares. So, for example, if the price that's offered by the acquirer to the target's shareholders is too low, then target shareholders may disapprove of the merger by not selling their shares, by not tendering their shares. If, on the other hand, the price is attractive, target shareholders may approve the merger by tendering their shares. Frequently, acquisition of stock is unfriendly in the sense that the target's management feels threatened that after the merger is completed, they may lose their jobs. So there's a number of devices that target management uses to fend off a merger through an acquisition of stock. We won't really get through these devices. There are things like poison pills, supermajority provisions, and so on and so forth that the target can adopt to fend off that unfriendly acquisition. The third type of transaction is a merger through an acquisition of assets, where the target sells most or all of its assets to the acquirer. A good example of that occurred when the Fleet Financial Corporation of Boston acquired all the credit card outstandings that Advanta Corporation of Philadelphia had. This occurred in the mid 1990s. The target's shareholders must approve of the transaction by voting upon that transaction. Of the three different types of transactions, the acquisition of assets is the most costly because the title to the assets needs to be transferred, and that can be a prolonged and costly occurrence. Okay, now that we have differentiated between these three different types of transactions, henceforth, everything that I say applies equally well to all three different types of transactions. Now, a merger may make sense because maybe the merger generates some synergy. What is synergy? Synergy is the idea that the merged firm is greater than the sum of its separate parts. What are some of the sources of synergy that may occur in a merger? Essentially, there are three different sources of synergy. Post-merger, the revenue of the merged firm might be greater than the sum of the revenues of the pre-merger separate firms. So just to bring this concept alive, suppose you have an acquirer and pre-merger the revenue of the acquirer is $500 million. For the target, the pre-merger revenue is $100 million. For revenue enhancement to occur, the post-merger revenue of the merged firm must be greater than $600 million. Another potential source of synergy is reduction of costs, and finally, a merger can reduce taxes. In the following slides, I am going to pick each of these three sources of synergy and discuss them in greater detail one by one. Number one, revenue enhancement. If two companies merge and post-merger, the merged firm has a monopoly in its market, then monopolies can charge higher prices, make more revenue, and increase the value of the company. Now, in the US, there are laws that prevent the creation of a monopoly through a merger. The Federal Trade Commission is the federal agency that's charged with the responsibility of preventing mergers that may create monopoly power. That's the federal agency. A number of states also have state agencies that carefully examine whether a merger will result in a monopoly or not. And if they conclude that the merger results in a monopoly, then they may stop the merger from occurring. In recent history, the two satellite TV networks, Dish Network and DirecTV, announced that they were going to merge. But the Federal Trade Commission stepped in and said that that merger would create a monopoly, and they denied the ability of those two firms to merge. Another counterexample is when the two radio satellite companies, Sirius and XM, agreed to merge. Most people would consider that the merger of Sirius and XM would result in a monopoly. However, the Federal Trade Commission, after studying that merger, declined to prevent that merger from occurring. Another potential source of revenue enhancement is the plugging of holes in product or service lines. If a company has a hole in its product line or service line, they have a choice to spend time and money to build that product and service and bring it to the market. For example, several years ago, Google concluded that people would be watching video online in great numbers. Now, at that time, they did have a service called Google Video, but for whatever reason, they were receiving very little traction on that service. They said, we should go out and acquire the best online video service that exists. So they identified YouTube as the best online service that existed at that time. Well, they went out and acquired YouTube. They paid a huge premium to acquire YouTube. They paid $2.65 billion to acquire YouTube. But they instantly plugged the hole in their video service, online video service product line. That was a fantastic acquisition by Google. Likewise, they didn't have any social media service, and they made a bid for Facebook, but Facebook turned them down, and Google has tried a number of different online social media services. I'm not sure whether Google Plus, their latest attempt, has a lot of traction or no. That remains to be seen.